I stood at the edge of the reception hall holding my son's hand, wearing the same blush dress my sister insisted I wear. I had paid for the cake, the flowers, the band playing on stage behind her. But when Rachel saw me, she didn't smile, she froze. And then in front of 200 people she turned to security and said I wasn't invited. Just like that. I wasn't family. My parents looked away. My brother fiddled with his cufflinks. No one said a word. I didn't cry, I didn't beg. I just walked out with Mason beside me, his small fingers curled into mine. What they didn't know was that while they were laughing under string lights and clinking champagne flutes, I was logging in from my hotel room. I opened every account they never knew had my name on it. The credit cards, the mortgage, the trust, the insurance. I had built the walls they lived in, and I was done keeping them warm. That night they lost me. Not because they pushed me out, but because I finally chose to stop standing in the shadows of a family that never once turned around to see me. Weddings bring out the best and worst in families. At least that's what I told myself as I folded Mason's tiny khakis and collared shirt into our suitcase. My sister Rachel was getting married in Savannah next weekend, and despite everything I was going, I always showed up. Even when they didn't want me there. Even when they pretended I wasn't already the one holding everything together. I was 35. A single mom. A business owner. But to my family, I was still the quiet one who had messed up early and never quite caught up. Rachel, on the other hand, was the golden child. At 37, she was polished, poised, and perfect. According to my mother, Rachel had a gift for planning things, for being gracious, for making everyone feel welcome. I snorted softly to myself. I'd read the group email she sent to family last week. No +1s unless they were engaged or legally partnered. No kids at the ceremony. And guests should wear muted tones so as not to detract from the theme. When I replied asking if Mason could come just to the reception, she never wrote back. Instead, Haley, my sister-in-law, texted me a passive little note saying Rachel was already overwhelmed with details and I should just make it easy on her. Right. Rachel didn't want me there. That much had been clear since she got engaged. Every message I got felt like a reminder that I wasn't part of the real family club. I was the footnote. The girl who had a baby out of wedlock. The sister who lived in Austin, ran some arts and crafts business, and didn't post curated Instagram photos of wine nights and yoga poses. They didn't know that Clay & Coast, the digital marketplace I built from scratch, had crossed 8 figures in revenue last year. They didn't know that I'd paid off my parents' mortgage under a fake church donor program, or that I was the reason Ethan, my older brother, got to walk out of law school debt-free. I didn't tell them because they never asked. And because I was tired of performing. This wedding, though, it tested me. Back in February, I got a call from the venue's finance coordinator. She said they were having issues verifying the original sponsor's payment method and the planning timeline was tight. I asked for details, and when I saw the numbers and how behind Rachel was, I made a decision. I didn't want to see my parents embarrassed. So, I had my attorney set up a shell LLC to quietly fund the rest of the wedding. Rachel never knew. She thought a local donor came through the nonprofit she once interned for. I thought maybe, just maybe, doing that would smooth things over. That she'd feel some kind of gratitude, even if she didn't know it was me. It didn't. A week later, she sent me a PDF of the dress code and suggested I choose something dusty, rose or beige if possible, so I wouldn't stand out in pictures. Mason wasn't even mentioned. I zipped the suitcase shut and took a breath. Mason was in the living room, curled up on the rug with his sketch pad and a set of markers. He looked up when he heard me. "Are we going to the wedding, Mom?" I said, kneeling beside him. "Just for the weekend. Then we'll come home and do something way more fun." "Will I get cake?" I smiled. "Maybe. If your aunt doesn't freak out about you breathing on the dessert table." He laughed and went back to his drawing. Later that night, after he went to bed, I opened my laptop to check on a few vendor payments for Clay & Coast. I'd been coordinating with our fabric partners in Oregon for a new holiday launch, but a new email notification stopped me cold. It was from the catering company handling Rachel's wedding. The subject line read "Final invoice reminder, unpaid balance remaining." I clicked. The invoice was for $47,000. Final headcount. Upscale custom menu. Service gratuity. Payment due in 72 hours. Below the breakdown was the listed billing contact: Shoreline Harbor Events LLC. My LLC. The one Carmen helped me form last year when I started investing quietly into events and real estate. I scrolled through the payment history. The previous deposits all paid on time. By me. This last payment, though, it hadn't gone through. The automatic draft had bounced back because I'd forgotten to approve it manually this time. My stomach twisted. I hadn't meant to forget. I'd just been busy planning new partnerships, juggling Mason's summer camp schedule. But now, sitting in the quiet glow of my kitchen lights, I stared at the screen and realized something strange. I wasn't in a rush to fix it. Rachel had spent months acting like this wedding was her victory lap. She'd made it seem like every detail had come from her perfect sense of taste and her carefully balanced credit score. No one knew she hadn't paid for a thing since March. And suddenly I wasn't sure I wanted to be invisible anymore. I closed the laptop slowly and looked around my little home in Austin. It wasn't grand, but it was real. Everything in it was mine. Every picture on the wall, every piece of furniture I refinished with my own hands, and the boy sleeping in the next room, he was mine too. He was watching me, learning from how I handled every small silence and every loud dismissal. The wedding could go on without me. But the truth had waited long enough. I stood up, poured the rest of my tea into the sink, and turned off the kitchen light. The email was still open on my screen when I walked away. The balance was still unpaid. The name on the account still mine, and for now I was leaving it exactly that way. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual. Mason was still asleep, his legs tangled in his dinosaur sheets, one arm flung over his stuffed octopus. I let him sleep while I packed the last of our things. The Georgia air was going to be sticky this time of year, but Rachel's wedding itinerary included an outdoor cocktail hour, a photo session at the historic fountain, and a seated dinner in some garden venue that probably cost more than my first apartment. I folded Mason's khakis and his tiny navy blazer, carefully placing them between his t-shirts and socks. I knew there was a good chance he wouldn't even wear the formal stuff. Rachel didn't want kids at the ceremony anyway, only at the reception, and even that felt like a reluctant concession. As I zipped up the suitcase, I paused to look at the side pouch. Tucked inside was the dusty rose dress I bought on sale, the exact shade Rachel requested. I hated the color. It made me feel like fading wallpaper. But I'd bought it anyway, not for her, but because I didn't want to give anyone another reason to whisper. There was a time when I didn't care so much about appearances. Years ago, I was engaged to a man named Daniel, a vascular surgeon from Houston. He had a calm voice, polished manners, and parents who sent out embossed Christmas letters every year. We dated for 2 years. He proposed at a vineyard in Fredericksburg in front of our families. Everyone clapped. My mother cried. Rachel said I finally did something respectable. But 6 months before the wedding, I called it off. I was already 2 months pregnant. I never told him. I never told anyone right away. I just knew I couldn't marry someone who didn't actually know me. Daniel liked the version of me who dressed conservatively and laughed at his father's stories. He liked the girl who agreed to cancel her art exhibit so she wouldn't miss his cousin's engagement dinner. But that wasn't me. The night I ended it, he asked if there was someone else. I said no. The truth was more complicated. I was someone else. And I wanted to live a life that felt like mine. When I told my parents the wedding was off, my mother looked at me like I'd killed something sacred. My dad didn't speak to me for 3 weeks. Rachel told people I had lost it under pressure. That was the start of my permanent reputation in the family, the unstable one. The disappointment. But I didn't regret it. Because a few months later, Mason came into my life. And while the world looked at me like I'd taken a detour, I knew I'd found my direction. In those early days, I worked nights assembling websites for local artists. I taught myself coding from YouTube videos and typed with one hand while nursing Mason with the other. My apartment was small, but it was ours. That was where Clay and Coast was born. First as a gallery site, then as a marketplace, then as something bigger than I'd ever imagined. No one in my family knew the details. They still called it your little Etsy thing. A ping from my phone pulled me back to the present. It was a reminder about our flight tomorrow morning. I clicked over to my inbox and there it was again blinking at the top of the screen. Final invoice reminder. Unpaid balance remaining. I stared at it for a moment. The last $47,000. The catering company was still waiting. 3 days until the wedding. If I didn't pay, it would be a mess. People would notice. My parents would panic. Rachel would explode. I didn't owe them anything. Not anymore. Still, I found myself opening my banking app. Mason walked into the kitchen rubbing his eyes, his hair pointing in every direction. "Hey buddy," I said, trying to sound lighter than I felt. "Are we going to the airport today?" "Tomorrow," I said. "Today we finish packing. Want waffles?" He nodded sleepily and curled up on the bar stool. I started the waffle maker and waited as the batter sizzled, the scent rising with the steam. When breakfast was done, Mason ate like he hadn't seen food in days, and I watched him wondering what he would remember from all of this. Would he remember the trip as a family gathering or as the day his mother finally let go? Once he ran off to draw spaceships, I went back to my laptop. I opened the invoice. My cursor hovered over the Pay Now button. I didn't want to do it, but I knew what would happen if I didn't. The scandal would fall on my parents, not on Rachel. They'd cover for her. They always did. But it would hurt them. And even if I was done being their silent savior, I wasn't ready to humiliate them. Not yet. I sighed and clicked. I confirmed the transfer from Shoreline Harbor Events, the shell company Carmen had set up for me 2 years ago. $25,000. The last of it. The balance was now zero. The wedding would go on without a hitch. The guests would eat, the speeches would flow, the cake would be served. And no one would know that the entire thing had been propped up by the woman no one wanted in the pictures. As the confirmation email arrived, I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair. The kitchen was quiet. Peaceful. The kind of peace that comes when you've done something that costs you but still feels like a choice. It wasn't about Rachel anymore. It wasn't about my parents. It was about control. They had made me feel small for years. But my name was on the contract. My signature made the celebration happen. They didn't need to know. But I would never forget. Savannah was humid in that particular way that clung to your skin and reminded you that every layer of clothing was one too many. Mason and I arrived at the estate late Friday afternoon, the day before the wedding, after a long connecting flight and a rental car that smelled like lemon air freshener and stale coffee. The venue was a historic white-columned mansion wrapped in vines and trimmed hedges, sitting smugly under the Georgia sun like it had been waiting to host something important. There were white folding chairs arranged in perfect rows on the lawn, signs pointing guests toward the ceremony arbor, and a small team of staff unloading floral arrangements from a white van. Hydrangeas. Everywhere. Mason gripped my hand tightly as we walked toward the entrance. "Do you think Aunt Rachel will say hi to me?" I squeezed his fingers gently. "We'll see, honey." Inside, the lobby smelled like peonies and wood polish. A woman in a headset and clipboard barely glanced at us before checking her list. When I gave her my name, her eyes scanned down and stopped. "Yes, you're here. Table 16 for the welcome dinner. But just so you're aware, children are not listed for the seated ceremony tomorrow." I smiled, trying not to show the flicker of irritation. "We'll only be at the dinner tonight." She nodded, already moving on. Haley spotted us near the reception area and came over in her peach floral dress, one arm already holding her phone up like she was waiting for the right moment to go live again. Her face broke into a bright, calculated smile. "Avery, wow, I didn't think you'd make it this early. Isn't this place amazing?" I looked around at the high ceilings and polished floors. I paid for the central chandelier in the entryway even though no one knew it. "It's beautiful," I said simply. "And this little guy, oh my gosh, Mason, look at you. So handsome." Mason mumbled a shy hello, hiding slightly behind my arm. Haley bent down slightly, then turned her body just enough so the light hit her cheekbones. I knew the pose. She was about to hit record. "Well, let me get Rachel. She's been running around like crazy. I'm sure she'll want to see you." I doubted that very much. Haley disappeared down the hall, heels clicking on the marble. I took a deep breath and led Mason toward the welcome table where place cards had been arranged alphabetically. I found mine small white printed in thin cursive. Avery Collins. Table 16, back corner. The seating chart was displayed on an easel and it was easy to spot the pattern. Immediate family up front, close friends in the middle. And then way in the back a row of tables near the catering entrance. My name. Tucked neatly among second cousins and plus ones. I didn't say a word. Later that evening as the welcome dinner began, Mason and I sat at our table while servers brought out tiny plates of what looked like hand-twisted pasta and deconstructed caprese salad. The other guests at our table included a man who worked with the groom and a woman named Denise who had a toy poodle in her purse. Mason quietly unwrapped a small pack of cookies I brought from home. He was doing his best. He always did. And I could see the effort in his posture, the way he tried to sit up straight and use his napkin like I taught him. Across the room, Rachel floated between tables laughing loudly, hugging people she hadn't seen in years. Her blonde hair was pinned up, a halo of baby's breath tucked into the curls. She looked exactly how I expected. Perfect, unbothered. Until Mason knocked over his water. It was a small glass. Just a few ounces. But it tipped sideways onto the white tablecloth, splashing over his cookies and the edge of the plate. I reached to grab it, dabbing quickly with my napkin. "It's okay," I whispered to him. "Accidents happen." Rachel's voice cut through the music. "What happened?" She was already walking toward us, her expression tight, smile frozen. I stood up. "It was nothing. Just a little spill." Rachel's eyes flicked from the soaked tablecloth to the water still dripping off the side of the table. Then to Mason, who was now hiding his face. "This is exactly why I didn't want kids at this event," she said loud enough for 3 nearby tables to turn and look. "No offense, Avery, but this is the kind of distraction we've been trying to avoid." My cheeks burned, but I kept my voice even. "He's 7. He spilled a glass of water. That's all." She tilted her head, tone sugary now. "I think it's best if you go. Tonight's supposed to be seamless. You're not even staying for the ceremony, right? People were watching." I picked up Mason's jacket and my purse. "We'll go." Rachel wasn't done. As I turned to walk away, she raised her voice. "Actually, you know what? Let's make this simple. You're not on the guest list tomorrow anyway. You're not welcome." Security. She didn't shout it. She didn't have to. One of the staff members looked toward her, then toward me. The silence in the room was deafening. No one moved. No one spoke. Not Ethan. Not Haley. Not my parents. They just sat there. Mason clung to my side, confused and embarrassed. I stood there for one more breath, then nodded at the staff member. "It's fine, we're leaving." I didn't look back. Under the dull glow of the hotel hallway lights, Mason's small footsteps echoed beside mine. He didn't speak, neither did I. His hand was warm and sticky in mine, and I could feel how hard he was trying to stay brave. When we reached our room, I slid the key card into the slot, opened the door, and locked it behind us. "Take off your shoes, baby," I said gently. He nodded and slipped them off without a word, then crawled onto the bed with his stuffed octopus and pulled the blanket up over his head. I stood in the center of the room, keys still in my hand, staring at nothing. My ears were still ringing from Rachel's voice. Not on the guest list. Not welcome. Security. Words that felt like they were still floating in the air around me, refusing to settle. I slowly placed my purse on the desk, kicked off my heels, and sat on the edge of the other bed. The air conditioning hummed low in the background, but the quiet was deafening. I opened my laptop. The screen lit up instantly. Notifications. Emails. One from the event planner, one from the venue. One from Shoreline Harbor Events. My shell company. All confirming the timelines. The catering setup was scheduled for 2:30 p.m. tomorrow. Ceremony at 4. Dinner at 6:30 sharp. Paid in full. Everything smooth. Everything seamless. Everything built on my silence. I scrolled through the transactions. I had tried to forget the breakdowns. But there they were, listed line by line. $6,000 for florals, $9,000 for venue coordination, $11,000 for rentals, $4,000 for live music, $2,000 for valet, and the largest $47,000 for the full-course dinner and reception. I had written every check so my parents could save face. So Rachel could pretend her influencer lifestyle came with an actual income. So no one would ask why the groom's family had funded the rehearsal dinner but not the rest. I told myself it was for Mason, for the image of a family he deserved to believe in. But the truth was uglier. I had done it out of habit, out of guilt, out of a deeply ingrained reflex to clean up after everyone else. I stared at the numbers again, fingers resting on the trackpad. The $47,000 was scheduled to be charged at 9 a.m. tomorrow. The final payment. The last thread keeping this illusion together. Rachel had told me to leave. Publicly. In front of 200 people. My father had looked away. My mother had pretended to sip her wine. No one spoke up. Not a single hand reached for mine as Mason and I were walked out like strangers. I clicked open a new tab and pulled up the contact form for the event catering team. I didn't draft the message immediately. I sat with the weight of the decision. The decision to let them taste for once the consequences of forgetting who held the power. I typed slowly. To events at Piedmont Catering. Calm subject. Urgent request to halt payment. Dear Julia. Please be advised that the final payment scheduled under Shoreline Harbor Events for Saturday's reception is no longer authorized. Do not proceed with the 9 a.m. charge. I understand this is short notice, but due to unforeseen circumstances, our partnership with the Collins wedding has been terminated. Thank you for your understanding. AC. I read it twice. Then hit send. It felt like exhaling for the first time in years. The truth was I didn't owe them a clean exit. Not after tonight. Not after being erased in the middle of a room I paid for. Let them scramble. Let them taste a fraction of the panic I'd been swallowing for years. I closed the laptop and sat in silence. Mason's breathing was steady under the covers. I got up quietly, pulled a bottle of water from the mini fridge and stepped out onto the tiny balcony. The city was quiet this late. I could see the distant glow of streetlights and the silhouette of moss-draped trees. The cool air hit my skin and I realized I wasn't angry anymore. Not really. I was done. Quietly, completely done. No announcement. No scene. Just one silent decision that would echo far louder than any of their words ever had. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I laid beside Mason, listening to the soft rhythm of his breath and staring at the ceiling of our quiet hotel room while memories I had locked away started knocking again. They always came back this time of year. Thanksgiving. Christmas. Mother's Day. All the days families were supposed to gather, laugh, remember they belonged to each other. Every year I bought my own gifts, wrapped them too. One year I even scribbled Mason's name on the tag so it felt like someone thought of me. My parents always claimed they were too busy or forgot to check shipping deadlines. Rachel once sent a group text saying she'd Venmo me later for a birthday she never mentioned again. And yet I made sure the table was full, the lights were hung, and no one ever had to ask where the money came from. I thought I was holding the family together. But really I was just patching over the cracks they refused to see. 3 years ago Rachel asked to borrow my name. That's how she phrased it. I need to get a line of credit for a side project. It's nothing big. You know how banks get weird when it's your first LLC. Can you just co-sign? It was more than that. She needed my name and my credit score. What she really needed was Clay and Coast's silent weight behind her to convince a bank in Nashville that she had backing. I let her. I didn't ask questions. I told myself I was helping her grow, that she just needed a little push. 2 months later, the business folded. A candle startup with overpriced branding and poor inventory control. She walked away unbothered. The bank came after the guarantor. Me. I paid off the remaining loan in full. $32,000. She never said thank you. She told her friends I had offered. That I believed in her. As if I had been begging to be involved. That was when I started documenting everything. Quietly. Every dollar, every loan. Every trust disbursement. I had a spreadsheet with tabs and dates and routing numbers. If they ever tried to rewrite the story, I would have the receipts. I opened my laptop again. The blue screen stung my eyes. It was still dark outside. I typed slowly, carefully, then attached the summary file I had created over the past year. To Carmen. Ayers at Ayers Legal Group. Subject immediate freeze on all family accounts. Hi Carmen. Please initiate a full review and freeze of the Collins Family Trust disbursements effective immediately. I'd like to revoke all automatic transfers and suspend access to the shared credit accounts listed in our previous documents. I also want to begin proceedings to dissolve the silent loan agreement with RC LLC. Let's discuss what needs to be done legally to protect future assets. Thank you. Avery. Carmen was my attorney but also someone who had watched this unravel slowly. She had once asked me why I kept giving so much. I never had an answer I believed in. I hit send and sat back. My fingers trembled slightly. That trust had been funding my parents' mortgage for 4 years. The shell company I set up paid my father's health insurance premiums, my mother's car lease, even their grocery deliveries through an automatic monthly transfer. They always made comments about being careful with money, living modestly, but they never once questioned why their bills seemed easier to cover than they should have been. Because I covered them. Rachel's college tuition. Paid. Ethan's small business seed fund. Paid. Their luxury beach rental last summer. Paid. None of it ever publicly credited to me. That was the condition I agreed to from the start. I wanted peace. I thought invisibility would buy me love. Or at least gratitude. Instead, it bought silence. Disrespect. Dismissal. I shut the laptop and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to watch the sunrise. A soft golden hue spread across the rooftops, warming the brick walls of Savannah. Somewhere across town, Rachel would be waking up, curling her hair, sipping something with collagen powder and oat milk, preparing for a ceremony paid for by someone she had ordered to be removed the night before. Except she wouldn't know yet. Not until the florist couldn't finish the centerpieces. Not until the venue called for confirmation and got radio silence. Not until the caterers didn't arrive. I imagined the moment she realized. And I felt nothing but calm. The air outside was cool and still as I stepped onto the balcony, barefoot, coffee cup in hand. Savannah's morning light was just starting to stretch across the rooftops, warm and golden, but there was a kind of silence in the sky that didn't match the chaos I knew was already brewing. I didn't need to guess what was happening at the venue. I knew the moment they opened their books, made their calls, and realized the biggest chunk of the bill hadn't gone through the ripple would be instant. The first call came at 6:42 a.m. I saw Rachel's name flash on my screen, watched it vibrate across the nightstand once, twice, before it went still. Then again. 645. 649. 652. By the time the fourth call came, I was seated at the desk with my laptop open. I didn't touch the phone. The text started just before 7. Are you serious? Why are the florists gone? The caterer said you canceled. What is wrong with you? Fix this now or I swear to God. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The silence spoke louder than anything I could have said. By 7:18, the group chat lit up. Mom, Dad, Ethan. All suddenly very aware of my existence now that the music had stopped playing and no one knew where the cake was. Avery, what is going on? This is your sister's big day. Did you touch the accounts? Tell me this is a mistake. Fix it now. Don't make this worse. Each message more frantic than the last, as if they were stacking bricks on a house that was already burning. I replied once. Just one sentence. You might want to ask the person who told me to leave. I turned the phone off and tucked it in a drawer. Mason stirred in bed behind me, rubbing his eyes as he sat up. You okay, bud? I asked softly. Yeah. You're making the sad face again, he said. I smiled, moved to sit beside him, and kissed the top of his head. Not sad, just done. He didn't ask what that meant. Just leaned into me, warm and drowsy, still safely tucked in the bubble I had built for him. After he went back to sleep, I returned to my desk. I logged into Shoreline Harbor's administrator dashboard. It was all there, laid out in neat columns and numbers. Every payment I had approved, every transfer that kept their lives floating, all hidden behind a company name no one ever cared to ask about. I clicked into the first tab: family credit accounts. Mom's card had a recent charge for a spa package, $487 at a boutique she pretended she couldn't afford when talking to her friends. Last month it was a trip to Orlando with her church group. The month before that, new furniture. I clicked suspend. Confirmed. Then Dad's transportation account. His SUV lease covered through a personal vehicle stipend I had arranged when his last investment project crashed. I reviewed the ledger, clicked terminate monthly transfer. Next, Ethan's fund. It had been disguised as a research grant. In reality, it paid for his rent, gaming setup, and occasional DoorDash splurges. I revoked access. Last was the health insurance policy. I had bundled them into a family coverage plan under my company's name, paying every premium for 6 years. Without it, they'd have to apply for independent coverage, and that would come with questions they wouldn't know how to answer. I removed their names, ended the coverage immediately. The screen blinked for a second before updating. All access removed. I leaned back in my chair. My fingers didn't tremble this time. It felt clean. No more invisible support. No more late-night bank transfers to fix someone else's chaos. No more hoping that if I gave enough, paid enough, loved enough, they might finally see me. I had seen enough of them. By 8 o'clock, the hotel phone rang. "Miss Collins," said the young man at the front desk. "There's a gentleman here. Says he's your father. Would like to speak with you. Tell him I'm unavailable. And please don't send anyone else up." "Of course, ma'am. He sounds upset." "I bet he does." I hung up and stared out the window again. The sky was blue, cloudless, wide. A perfect day for a wedding. I wondered what they would tell the guests. That a vendor pulled out last minute, that there was a fire, an emergency. Would Rachel lie? Would she cry and act the victim? Probably. That's always been her way. But this time the mess wasn't mine to clean. By late morning, the hotel manager called. The venue had tried to reach me, apparently confused about the reception being canceled and who held authority. I told them they'd need to direct all questions to the client. I was no longer involved, and I meant that. I wasn't involved in the endless emotional debt my family had kept me in for 35 years. I wasn't involved in their curated lies or borrowed success. I was the scaffolding. The one holding up the whole structure while they smiled for photos. But not anymore. I closed my laptop, made myself a second cup of coffee, and sat on the balcony again. Below, I saw tourists walking toward the river, couples laughing, a girl in a white dress taking photos in front of an old brick wall. Life kept moving. It always did. And somewhere across town, Rachel was trying to explain why the biggest day of her life was unraveling. I sipped slowly and said it again quietly, to no one in particular. I don't owe anyone anymore. Under the same Savannah sky that had witnessed so much of my quiet unraveling, I zipped up my suitcase without hesitation. There was no ceremony to it, no tears or lingering thoughts. Just the firm, steady motion of a woman who had finally stopped carrying everyone else's weight. Mason helped fold his clothes, lining up his socks like he'd seen me do 100 times. "Are we going back home now?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Back home, just you and me." The drive to the airport was silent except for the hum of the road beneath us. I didn't need music. I didn't need noise. For once, the quiet felt earned. Like breathing room after years of holding it in. When we touched down in Austin, the city welcomed us with its familiar heat. Our apartment was just as we'd left it, neat, functional, untouched by drama. I set down the bags, opened the windows, and let the late afternoon light spill in. I changed into an old t-shirt, pulled my hair into a knot, and sat down at my desk. Carmen had sent a short message earlier that morning confirming the first phase of financial cuts had been legally processed. I called her back. She answered on the second ring. "Hey Avery. You okay?" "Yes. I just want to finish it." "Understood. We'll move ahead with the final paperwork. The trust distributions will stop next week, and I'll send over confirmation regarding the corporate filing and dissolution." "Thank you, Carmen." She hesitated. "You sure about the shell company?" Once we shut that down, it's permanent. That's the idea. We exchanged a few more instructions, brief and precise. Carmen never asked why. That's one of the reasons I trusted her. She didn't need to understand my past to help me end it. By nightfall, Mason was asleep in his room. I stood in the doorway watching him for a long time. His face was peaceful, still free from the tangled webs adults wove around love, duty, and guilt. I wasn't going to pass those patterns down to him. In the quiet of my office, I logged into the portal for Shoreline Harbor Financial. The shell company had been registered under my name but buried beneath layers of legitimate accounts. For 5 years, it had been my tool for anonymous generosity. Paying off Rachel's student loans, covering Ethan's car accident settlement, making my parents' lives easier while they never once asked how. I opened the file labeled Shoreline Dissolution Packet. It was all there. Carmen had already prepared everything. I scanned it signed digitally, then hit submit. A soft confirmation appeared. Submission received. Entity will be dissolved within 10 business days. I stared at the screen. That was it. No fireworks, no thunderclap. Just a quiet line of text marking the end of something invisible but massive. I closed the laptop and let my hand rest over it. They never knew I existed in that way. Never knew it was me keeping their lives afloat. And now they never would. I moved to the closet and pulled down a small leather box from the top shelf. Inside was the deed to a beachfront house on Maui. I had bought it last year quietly using a separate holding company with no paper trail connected to my family. It had taken years of work, risk, late nights building clay and coast from my studio apartment while rocking a baby to sleep. But it was mine. Not a gift. Not a handout, earned. I placed the deed in my carry-on. Then I opened my travel app and booked 2 one-way tickets to Kahului. Departure Wednesday. Direct flight. Premium seats. I didn't even flinch at the cost. After that, I drafted a quick email to Mason's school explaining we'd be relocating for an extended period. I'd already arranged homeschooling options and community learning centers in Maui. I had built a plan long before the wedding ever happened. Because deep down I had known this day would come. It was almost 2 in the morning when I poured myself a glass of water and stepped out onto the balcony. Austin's skyline blinked in the distance, unaware of the small transformation unfolding inside this quiet corner. I wasn't angry anymore. Not even bitter. The sadness had peeled away slowly over the years, replaced by something sharper, clearer. I used to wonder what it would take for my family to see me. Now I realized it didn't matter. I had already left them long before Rachel told me to. That night, I opened a blank notebook and wrote 3 lines on the first page. Day 1. New story. No more shadows. Then I closed the book and went to sleep. The morning light in Maui was a kind of quiet I had never known. Not the kind of quiet that came from silence, but the kind that came from peace. Real peace. The air was warm, kissed with salt and hibiscus, and when I opened the sliding glass doors, Mason was already out on the patio building a tiny city in the sand with his plastic trucks. "Mom, this one's got a pool," he said, proudly pointing at a crater filled with ocean water. I smiled, kneeling beside him, brushing hair from his forehead. "Looks like luxury," I teased, and he laughed like it was the best thing he'd ever heard. For the first time in years, I wasn't holding my breath. I wasn't walking on the edge of someone else's expectations. Our little beach house was still half unpacked, but every room felt more like home than any house I'd ever grown up in. In the kitchen, I brewed coffee, slowly letting the sound of the waves and Mason's chatter fill the space instead of news or emails or someone else's voice rising to criticize. My phone stayed face down on the counter. I had no desire to see if they'd called again. Let them stew in the silence they created. Later that afternoon, while Mason napped curled in a towel by the lanai, I sat on the porch with my leather notebook and opened it to a fresh page. I didn't plan what to write. I just started. I wrote about the baby shower I threw for Rachel, how I handmade all the decorations and paid for the entire event while she pretended her startup was funding it. I wrote about the time Dad's car broke down and I wired the money from a separate account while he thanked Ethan for figuring it out. I wrote about Ethan's dental work covered under my insurance as a business partner of Clay and Coast. He never knew. None of them knew. I wrote about every birthday dinner I wasn't invited to. Every Christmas gift labeled, from all of us that I bought and wrapped alone. I wrote about the time I walked into a room and they went quiet as if the truth of me ruined their narrative. I wrote until the sun dipped low and my fingers ached. I didn't cry. I wasn't sad. These were just pages I needed to empty so they wouldn't live in me anymore. That evening I called Carmen again. She answered immediately. Avery. Everything all right. More than all right. I need your help with something new. I explained the idea to her slowly. A fund, not a business, not a loan system. A true grant-based support system for women who had to rebuild their lives from nothing while carrying everything. Artists, designers, dancers, women who were told to get real jobs or stop dreaming the moment they became mothers. I want to name it the Women's Shoreline Fund. It'll be built on the principle of quiet strength. Like the ocean, I said. Steady. Undeniable. Carmen paused. That's beautiful, Avery. What's the mission to help single mothers create? Not survive, create. The world doesn't need another survival program. It needs belief in potential, not just pity. By the end of the call, she agreed to draw up the paperwork, and I promised to send the initial seed funding from my private account the next morning. 10% of Ti.K.T.ok's quarterly profit. Quietly allocated. No press release. No big announcement. Just impact. The next few days passed like something out of a dream I didn't realize I'd had. We went to the farmer's market and picked starfruit and dragonfruit Mason had never seen before. We signed up for local community programs. I met a sculptor named Maria who ran beachside art classes for kids and offered to enroll Mason for free after hearing our story. Except I didn't give her our story. Just the clean version. A move. A fresh start. A mother and son building a new life by the ocean. One night, as Mason slept in his new bunk bed and the surf whispered outside our window, I stood at the bathroom mirror and looked at myself like a stranger. The lines around my eyes weren't from age, they were from restraint, from holding in every word I'd never said. And now, without those words, my face looked softer. Not weak, just mine. I walked out onto the balcony in my robe, moonlight casting silver on the railing, and opened my notebook one last time that day. On the top of the next blank page, I wrote a sentence in all caps. I am not a shadow. And this time I believed it. The first headline came on a Tuesday. Local bride sued for breach of contract after lavish wedding collapse. It popped up on a Maui news aggregator app I hadn't even realized was still synced to my old feeds. There was Rachel mid-laugh in a photo taken weeks earlier standing next to a floral arch that I had paid for, but she never got to walk beneath. By Thursday, it was all over. The venue had filed suit for unpaid services. The catering company was also joining, demanding over $40,000. The article outlined how the contract had been signed by a third-party holding company which had since been dissolved. No one could reach the account holder. I sipped my coffee, slowly sitting barefoot on the porch, while Mason built another sand village nearby. My phone buzzed with more alerts, all tracing back to Savannah. Rachel's name was being dragged through local Facebook groups, the ones she used to moderate with her signature tone of faux kindness and subtle judgment. Now people were posting screenshots of payment confirmations, cancellation notices, gossip from servers who were let go mid-shift that night. One even said the groom's family had to pitch in to keep the bar open long enough for toasts. But the damage wasn't limited to her. Another headline read, Savannah nonprofit director investigated for misuse of funds. That was Ethan. Apparently someone flagged the large transfers he had been receiving monthly for nearly 2 years. Money routed through shell accounts labeled Legacy Consulting. One of them traced back to an entity now inactive. My entity. The IRS had opened a preliminary audit. Rachel was seen leaving their parents' house in tears. Then came the part I didn't expect. Mom lost her insurance. I don't know how the news reached me. Maybe Carmen saw it, maybe it came up in a news ticker, but it hit differently. Not because I felt guilty, but because she had been so sure I would always keep her safe. Her silence when Rachel threw me out had been louder than any scream. Still, part of me had once wanted her to step forward. But she hadn't. And now the lifeline she never thanked me for was gone. Despite everything falling apart, no one called me. Not Rachel. Not Ethan. Not even Dad. It wasn't that they respected my silence. It was that they had no idea where I was. And even if they did, I wasn't who they believed I was anymore. The version of me they used to lean on had evaporated the moment I hit delete on that shell company. That weekend, something shifted. An old friend sent me a screenshot of a post from Mrs. Joy Adams, our neighbor back in Charleston. She was in her 70s now, retired and still active online in a very southern, very no-nonsense way. Her post began simply, "I've stayed quiet long enough. Y'all need to know something about Avery Collins." She wrote about the time my mom was sick and didn't tell anyone. Avery's car was in their driveway every morning at 6 a.m. with fresh groceries and prescriptions. She wrote about the summer Ethan found the money to buy that vintage Mustang. How the check had Avery's handwriting on it when she accidentally dropped the envelope. She wrote about how Rachel's business only got off the ground because Avery co-signed the lease under a private LLC. And how Avery's name never appeared on anything public because she never wanted recognition. "That girl has more grace in her silence than most folks have in their entire lives," Joy wrote. "Y'all built an empire on her back and blamed her for standing too tall." The comments were explosive. I had no idea. She always seemed so quiet. Rachel said she never helped with anything. This is shocking. But it makes sense. I didn't comment. I didn't even react. I just sat there looking at my screen, feeling a strange combination of release and sorrow. It wasn't about revenge. It was about someone finally seeing me without me having to hold up a sign. That night, I walked down to the beach with Mason. He held my hand as we tiptoed into the tide. "Look," he said, pointing at the sky, "the moon's following us." "Maybe it is," I smiled, brushing his curls back. "Maybe it's making sure we're okay." We stood there quietly, ankle-deep in water, the moonlight silvering the waves around us. And for the first time, I wasn't watching the past burn behind me. I was watching my future come into view. The envelope sat on my kitchen counter like it didn't carry decades of silence. I hadn't seen that handwriting in years, but I knew it instantly. Slanted and elegant, every loop and line the same as on the birthday cards she used to leave blank inside because she didn't know what to write. The letter had been forwarded from my old Austin address. She had sent it to a P.O. box return, not their house, like she wasn't ready to be that vulnerable yet. I let it sit there for hours. I made Mason lunch. I watered the succulents on the lanai. I wiped down the counter twice, even though it was already clean. My fingers hovered above the envelope more than once, but I didn't touch it again until the house was quiet, the sun low, and the ocean soft and blue beyond the windows. I opened it with a butter knife. No drama. No ritual. Just curiosity, maybe a little fear. "Avery, I don't deserve a reply. I don't even expect one. I just needed to tell you I was wrong." I read those first lines 3 times before continuing. Her handwriting was neat, controlled, but I imagined her hands shaking just slightly as she wrote. "I've thought about what happened that day, what I did and didn't do. I've thought about the way you walked away and how no one followed. I let Rachel speak for all of us. And in doing that, I failed you. I didn't raise you to be invisible. But somehow I let you become that in your own family." There was no defense, no justification. No blame placed on Rachel or wedding stress or misunderstanding. Just acknowledgement. "You were the steady one, the strong one, the one who never asked for credit but gave it anyway. I didn't see it until you were gone. I hope wherever you are you're safe, you're happy, and you're with people who see all that you are." I folded the letter slowly. My chest ached in a way I hadn't felt in months. Not the sting of rejection, not anger. Something more fragile. Something like being seen just a little too late. I didn't cry. I tucked the letter under a coaster and watched the steam rise from my mug of chamomile tea. The next morning my phone buzzed with a call from Ethan. I almost didn't answer. I stared at his name on the screen until the call nearly timed out. Then I pressed accept. "Hey," he said quietly. I waited. "I owe you an apology," he continued. "And probably a lot more than that." There was no bravado in his voice. No arrogance. Just a tired honesty. I'm working with auditors restructuring everything. I know it's a mess. I know I let it get there. You never once said anything, never asked for credit, but you kept the lights on in more ways than I knew how to admit. He took a breath. We grew up thinking asking for help was weakness. I realize now you weren't just helping. You were holding up the roof while we pretended to build the walls. I didn't respond right away. I just listened. I didn't promise anything. Didn't offer comfort. I let his words hang between us like they belonged to him, not me. Before we hung up, he added, "I hope you're okay." I mean that. I believed him. But I also knew that believing didn't mean inviting back in. Later that afternoon, my phone pinged again. This time it was Rachel. Just us. Can we talk 5 words? No punctuation, no context. Like nothing had ever happened, like I was just another contact on her list. I read the message once. Then I put the phone face down on the table. I didn't respond. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't silence for silence's sake. I had simply outgrown the version of myself who needed that conversation to feel whole. That evening, Mason sat cross-legged on the floor with his sketchpad tongue poking from the corner of his mouth as he colored in a crooked palm tree. His sun was purple, his ocean was yellow. He hummed a tune I didn't recognize, and I let it fill the room like a blessing. I watched him for a long time. His joy was so simple, so unburdened. I picked up the envelope from the table, folded it in thirds, and walked to the bedroom. In the bottom drawer of my dresser sat a few keepsakes I had carried from place to place. A worn photo of Mason and me in front of our first shared apartment. A dried hibiscus bloom from our first week in Maui. A ribbon from one of the gallery shows I had curated years ago in Austin. I placed the letter beside them. I didn't lock the drawer. Forgiveness isn't always about forgetting. Sometimes it's just choosing to set something down instead of carrying it further. It's making space where pain used to live. I closed the drawer gently. Then I returned to Mason and took a seat beside him on the floor. He handed me a blank sheet and a green crayon. "Draw something with me, Mommy." I smiled and began. Under Mason's direction, my palm tree leaned too far left and my waves looked more like spaghetti noodles, but he beamed like I had painted the Mona Lisa. We taped our drawings on the sliding glass door and watched the sunlight filter through the crayon lines. He declared the living room an art gallery and made me promise not to sell any of the masterpieces until he was famous. I told him I wouldn't take a single offer under $1 million. He laughed and said even that was too cheap. Later that week, I woke early and walked down to the water before the island heat set in. I stood ankle-deep in the surf, breathing with the tide. When I returned to the house, I found an email waiting for me from Nora, my CFO at Ti.K.T.ok. The subject line read, "We did it." I opened the message and stared at the number on the screen. Our total revenue for the last quarter had broken every projection. Our Seattle partnership had gone live. 3 of our ceramic lines were already backordered. I clicked through the attached images of our pieces displayed in the storefront window of a boutique near Pike Place. Our matte sage bowls stacked beside glass vases, the little handwritten tags still bearing my sketches. Nora had written one final line. "The board wants to celebrate." You and I replied simply, "Raise a glass for me. I'll be watching from the sand." I forwarded the revenue report to Carmen as well, along with a short message, "Time to expand the fund." 2 hours later, she called. "So, guess who's getting their first shoreline grant?" I leaned back against the lounge chair listening. A 27-year-old in Missoula. Single mom, 1 kid, just finished an apprenticeship in ceramics. She wants to open her own studio, but no bank will touch her. You should see the photos she sent with her application. Her hands are covered in glaze, and she's smiling like nothing could stop her. I asked Carmen to send me her name and address. I wanted to write her a letter. Not from Ti.K.T.ok, not from a foundation board, but from me. From someone who had once stood in the same shoes, covered in the same clay, carrying the same fears. After we hung up, I walked into the kitchen where Mason sat at the table, tongue out again in concentration as he cut shapes from construction paper. He was making a mosaic, he said. The kind they saw in a museum once in San Antonio. He looked up when I came in and held out his hand. Sitting in his small palm was a smooth spiral seashell. tiny cream-colored with faint amber lines. "I found it on the beach," he said. "It's for you." I turned it over in my hand. "Thank you, sweetheart." "It's special," he said. "It can be your logo." My logo. Yeah, so when people see it, they know it's you. They'll know you're the good guy. I looked at him and felt something inside me soften. I pressed the shell to my lips. "That's the best gift I've ever gotten." He beamed, then went back to his mosaic. I placed the shell on the shelf above my desk beside a small ceramic piece I had made years ago back when I still worked out of my apartment at night while Mason slept in the next room. A bowl imperfect, lopsided, but fired with care. It reminded me where I came from. The shell reminded me where I was going. That evening, I sat down and wrote the young woman in Montana. I told her I had once been a single mom with dreams and limited options. I told her about long nights and chipped nails and the quiet joy of pulling a piece from the kiln that finally came out right. I didn't tell her who I was. I didn't mention money or fame or the business. I just wrote to her as one woman to another, as one dreamer to one who dared. When I folded the letter and sealed the envelope, I placed a tiny copy of Mason's shell drawing inside. "Just in case you need a reminder," I wrote in the margin. Back on the lanai, Mason curled up beside me as the stars came out, the air warm and still. We watched the sky for shooting stars and made up names for constellations that didn't exist. He pointed out one that looked like a teacup, then a dragon, then a dog in sunglasses. "You're gonna be okay, Mommy," he said sleepily. I kissed his hair and whispered, "I already am." I tucked Mason into bed, kissed his forehead one more time, and walked out to the lanai with a mug of warm tea. The night air smelled like sea salt and plumeria. Waves kissed the sand just yards from my feet, a gentle hush rising and falling like breath. I sank into the cushioned chair beneath the porch light, wrapped the blanket around my legs, and let the quiet hold me. For a long time, I thought the day Rachel threw me out of her wedding would be the memory that hurt the most. I thought that moment would haunt me forever. But tonight, when I closed my eyes and saw it again, I didn't feel the sting. I didn't feel small. I felt free. It wasn't the end of my story. It was the moment I stopped asking for a seat at their table and built my own instead. They had written me out, quietly, gradually, as if I would never notice. But I had. And I had walked away. No screaming, no spectacle. Just steps taken one after another until I stood in a life I had made with my own hands. Clay and Coast had just signed a distribution deal with a major home goods brand. We were going national. We had hired 3 new artists last month. The grant fund had received its 8th application in 2 weeks. Carmen was already drafting a proposal to grow the nonprofit arm. Mason had started calling the house ours, not the rental or the beach house, just ours. He helped water the plants each morning. He built elaborate forts with driftwood and leaves. He had stopped asking about Grandma or Uncle Ethan or Aunt Rachel. They hadn't tried to call in weeks, not since the last check bounced, not since the invoices came due. Maybe they had finally understood that the pipeline had ended. Maybe not, it didn't matter anymore. Their silence was just another kind of answer. I reached over and picked up the small spiral shell Mason had given me. It sat beside a candle and a stack of books. I turned it between my fingers, listening to the soft whir of wind curling through its hollow center. It was strange the way the body learns to relax again. How stillness no longer feels like danger. How joy doesn't require permission. I used to think I had to be quiet to be safe, to be needed to be seen. I used to think love meant sacrifice, and that family meant debt. But none of that was true. Not really. What was true was this: I had built a business from nothing. I had raised a kind, curious, brilliant little boy. I had protected people who never thanked me and then let them go without vengeance. I had chosen myself, finally, not out of spite, but out of truth. Joy Adams had emailed me a few days ago. She had seen the post go viral, the one she had written after everything unraveled back home. She said strangers were messaging her, thanking her for speaking up. She said people were finding courage in her words. She said she hoped I was proud. I was. Of her, of me. Of the messy, winding, imperfect path that had brought me here. I heard the creak of the screen door behind me and turned. Mason padded out barefoot, rubbing his eyes. Couldn't sleep? I asked softly. He shook his head and climbed into my lap, his small body curling easily into mine. He looked out toward the water. It's loud tonight. That's the tide pulling back, I said. Getting ready for tomorrow. He rested his head against my chest and closed his eyes again. I held him there, feeling the rise and fall of his breath. And mine. In the morning, we'd go to the farmer's market. He'd ask to buy fruit we wouldn't finish. I'd let him. We'd come home and I'd shape clay with my hands and write letters to women who hadn't been seen in years. We'd eat pancakes for dinner and fall asleep on the couch watching a movie neither of us would finish. I didn't need grand gestures anymore. I didn't need apologies wrapped in flowers or phone calls filled with excuses. I didn't need the family I was born into to understand the woman I had become. I just needed this. This moment. This peace. This love I had built from the ground up. Maybe you've been there too. Maybe you've stood quietly in the back of someone else's story hoping they'd turn and finally see you. Maybe you've waited for permission that never came, for gratitude that never arrived. Maybe you've given until there was nothing left but your name on a bill no one would claim. And maybe one day you walked away. If you did, tell me. Tell me what made you choose yourself. Tell me how it felt the first time the silence didn't hurt. Tell me what freedom tastes like in your life. Because I believe you're not alone. And neither am I.